right. Welcome, everyone, to the Commonwealth Club. We're downstairs, but intimate venue. It's and sold out, so thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. My name's Ken Broad. My wife and I are big supporters and fans of the Commonwealth Club. I love reading books, and this is a temple to books and authors. So again, thank you for coming out, and thank you to Dan and DJ for hosting the conversation. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. Dan Wang is a research fellow at Hoover History Lab at Stanford University and author of Breakneck: China's Quest to Engineer the Future. His book is a riveting portrait of China's seismic progress and as a nation in flux and what it ultimately means for America. Through the in-depth political, economic, and philosophical analysis, Dan reveals provocative new framework for understanding China, as well as the shocking contrasts with the United States. One country builds a lot of high-speed rail, the other one, not so much. Previously, Dan was a fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center and the technology analyst at GaveCal Dragonomics. Moderating tonight's program is DJ Patel, former U.S. Chief Data Scientist, General Partner at Great Point Ventures, and a member of Commonwealth Club World Affairs Board of Governors. He is fantastic. He's probably my favorite moderator. So please join me in welcoming both Dan and DJ.
All right. Thanks, sir. All right.
Thanks, Ken.
All right. This is actually, I really love this because we're in a nice, this is like really good and intimate. And thank you for being here. Dan, congrats on this book. It is taken off.
Thank you.
Just got put as the Financial Times in their top list of books of the year.
It's a finalist for the FT Book of the Year award, yes.
So that's a big deal.
Thank you.
Congrats. That's no small accolade. Since you've been out there talking about this book, probably a lot of people have heard about the book, different things. I think we should just level set really quickly about the thesis of the book and predominantly your framing of the U.S. and China, which I thought was a wonderful way for me to mentally lock in how to think about it of a lawyerly society versus an engineering state. So maybe walk us through the fast version of it.
Yeah, the quick version of this is that I spent 2017 to 2023 living in China, a time that felt really momentous as I was living through it. I moved to China after working here in San Francisco at the start of 2017, and Donald Trump had just taken office. Then he was launching a trade war, something that quickly morphed into a technology war. Xi Jinping was being more repressive in some novel ways throughout this time. China was growing to be a more credible technology country in which was producing all sorts of new technology champions. And the centerpiece of my experience of living in China was to go through the entirety of the zero COVID experience, all 3 years from 2020 to the end of 2022. And I started to feel that these are two really important countries, and we're sort of reasoning through them with these 19th century political science terms like socialist, capitalists, neoliberal, all of these very strange terms that shift around and don't really mean very much anymore. And so the framework that I wanted to toss out to be playful and provocative is to think about China as a country I call the engineering state, because at various points, the entirety of the senior leadership have had degrees in engineering, and to talk about the U.S. as a lawyerly society, because all the presidents seem to have to go to Yale Law School. So I think I think about the engineering state in part because China treats almost every problem with an engineering solution of just building one more mega project, building yet another big bridge, building yet another set of homes. They also treat the economy as an engineering project. One of the other things that I lived through was Xi's attempt to get people out of real estate speculation and into, for bright young kids to work in semiconductors or aviation instead. And they are also fundamentally social engineers. So, when I think about something like the one-child policy or zero COVID, there's no ambiguity about what these sort of things mean. The number's right there in the name. It really feels like a social optimization project. And I think about the United States, which has been characterized over the last few decades as basically not building very much of anything at all. I think about a lot about how most of the founding fathers were lawyers first 16 presidents from Washington to Lincoln. 13 of them had practiced law. Every presidential nominee among the Democrats between 1980 to 2024 had gone to law school at some point. And what are we getting, especially in California? Not enough home construction, high-speed rail project that was approved by referendum in the year 2008 and will probably not have any riders by 2033 at the earliest. And a lack of urgency about a lot of manufacturing projects. And so this is kind of my starting framework for thinking about both these big countries.
Lawyers versus engineers.
That's right.
And mindset.
That's right.
And so maybe just take that a little bit further for us in the places where it concretely manifests in a juxtaposition of policy.
Yeah. Well, let's contrast a policy of, let's go back to high-speed rail. I promise let's not make this whole evening about high-speed rail. This is too upsetting, but just one instance. Let me start with an illustrative example. So 2008 was an important year for high-speed rail in both countries. California approved by referendum the high-speed rail project between San Francisco as well as Los Angeles. And China actually started construction of its first high-speed rail train between Beijing and Shanghai in 2008. What did China do? 3 years later, it completed its line at the cost of, I think, something like $36 billion.
And distance-wise, just to help people orient.
Yeah. About actually the same distance. About the same distance. And actually, after the rail extension to Sacramento, if that ever gets completed, it will be almost exactly the same distance. In China, the trains are going through much more densely populated areas. In California, it's mostly going through the desert. But China completed all of this, and in the first decade of operation, according to the official news, it had made something like 1.3 billion passenger trips. What is the status of California high-speed rail? Well, by 2033 is the earliest possible time that Merced and Bakersfield will be connected. These are pretty far from Los Angeles.
I feel like we need like a soundtrack of like wah wah wah.
Well,
like
there it is.
It is. Well, the reason I want to go through this a little bit more quickly than you have in some of the other places is since you've been on tour, that you've had a phenomenal number of conversations with leaders in government, businesses, scholarly events. And so what I really think is a unique lens to take people on today is given how much has changed in the policy, in the landscape, the discussion points between China and the U.S., since the pens down for writing the book, not even publication date. And so maybe to start with that, what do you believe, what myth have you found here in the United States and in China is the myth of each other that is most harmful in actually helping us actually collectively solve problems?
Yeah. Well, on the American side, I think the myth has been that China cannot be innovative, that they can only steal, that, in fact, quoting verbatim from a tweet from Senator Tom Cotton a few months ago, which he tweeted on World IP Day, China can only steal, can never innovate. And I think these are the sort of things that really limit our understanding of the world. I think that, it is more than just, cyber theft or industrial subsidies that has gotten China to where it is. I look at China today and I see a remarkably dynamic, remarkably competitive country in which they are innovating really quickly and iterating really quickly on all sorts of projects. My favorite example to reach now is that, it takes something like 6 to 7 years for a Detroit automaker to conceptualize of a car and then actually have that go out on the roads and have that be driven by people. This is comparable to the Japanese. This is comparable to the Germans as well. In China, it is much more like 18 months. It is much more like 2 years for them to be able to actually release these sort of cars. And so they're just iterating much more quickly. And this is not because they have somehow hypnotized the rest of the world to move really slowly. It is in part because China moves at breakneck speeds. And I think the Chinese misconception here is that the U.S. is fundamentally, really rowdy and they can't get its act together, and that Donald Trump is just way too erratic. Maybe on that point, they're kind of correct.
No comment.
But no comment on that. But in a lot of ways, they take a look at the U.S., they take a look at San Francisco, and they're not terribly impressed. And I think this is just how many ordinary Chinese have lost considerable interest in visiting California or New York or a lot of other American places, because they feel that the state of logistics is just not very impressive actually being over here. And so, I would hate for the Chinese to make some sort of miscalculation that they believe that the American society is fundamentally going to be riven apart, that too many things don't work, and I want America to prove that it can do much better than it has.
Do you feel like this is akin to some of the challenges we had during the height of the Cold War, where people in the U.S. didn't understand Russia, the people of Russia, society, other than through this lens of movies like Red Dawn and other type situations? Or are we actually, because are we seeing a little bit, is it just nuances that we're off the mark on?
Yeah, I think that we need to. It's interesting you bring up something like Red Dawn in terms of entertainment. And, at least in the Cold War, we had this conception that the Russians were very fearsome and they're really dangerous. But because China controls a giant market of moviegoers, Hollywood is really keen not to upset the Chinese. And so they, who was the adversary in Top Gun Maverick? Totally unclear. There was they had no insignia, and so we have no idea. And so we're not even portraying the Chinese as the adversaries. In fact, we're not able to portray the Chinese in our movies almost at all. I think in some strange ways. And so there is some way in which I think Americans are fundamentally occluded about China. Very few Americans visit China. I think that's just a fundamental truth. The number of foreign expats in Shanghai peaked, I think, something like 15 years ago, and it keeps going down further and further. And so, people aren't visiting, aren't traversing these two in a very, frequent way anymore. And I think, I'm always on the side of more understanding. And part of why I wrote this book was to, expect that plenty of Americans will never visit China. And what I really wanted to do with this book, to write through the three main regions that I lived in, Hong Kong, Beijing, as well as Shanghai. These are three of China's most dynamic hubs. To write through a little bit of the countryside of Guizhou that I cycled through, to write a little bit about the city of Chongqing, which is this hydropunk city, which is really big with the influencers now. It goes viral regularly on TikTok. To just give people a sense that life in China is densely textured. Some parts of it work really well, some parts of it work disastrously, and to just give people a little bit of sense that this is a flesh and blood, real life living place. Mm-hmm.
Well, to your point, maybe let's go on this direction, because one of the things that you point out is China can produce now some phenomenal technology. I want to get back to the technology in a little bit, but one of the things you also highlight is China doesn't know how to export culture.
Yeah.
And the part that I thought was really interesting was the analogy of Japan. Japan has actually become a cultural powerhouse in many dimensions, not just from film and anime, but fashion and other things.
Yeah. I think that, if we analogize to the Japanese, Japan, when it was growing really rich throughout the 1970s especially, it was throwing off all of these incredible cultural products that the rest of the world loved. So, maybe you played people here have played the Nintendo Game Boy, the Sony Walkman, anime, manga, you name it. The Japanese were producing incredible things like Mario Brothers that have still persisted today. Even the Koreans, which is much smaller than Japan. Korea's population is about 50 million. Japan is 120 million. China's 10 times bigger than Japan. Even the Koreans, we're all watching Squid Game and we're all listening to K-pop, and that is still ongoing. And when I think about China, China has lifted about basically 1 billion people out of poverty. It has made several 100 million people middle class, and maybe a few tens of millions of people very rich indeed. It has grown tremendously, and yet how many of us have been able to find many cultural products that we regularly use? And I think to some extent TikTok is a Chinese product, even though it is not necessarily producing a lot of Chinese content. Maybe some of us watch some of these art house movies by Jia Zhangke, but I think that is kind of a niche little director. And maybe some of us are reading the science fiction books of Liu Cixin, which I think are absolutely tremendous, The Three-Body Problem, but that is still, again, a little bit of a niche product. And my, easy explanation for most of this is that China is ruled by engineers. Engineers aren't very good at jokes. They're not very good at telling stories. You go to a party with an engineer and some of them don't even want to talk to anyone. And so they're not like the lawyers. Lawyers are...
We don't go to parties.
Oh, okay. All right. No, yeah, you won't even find them at the parties, right? The lawyers do go to the parties. They're the most charming people at the cocktail parties. They're smooth talkers. They reliably have good stories. And so the U.S. has this cultural power. China has mostly censored a lot of cultural creation. It has strangled a lot of cultural creation because the engineers have thin skins and don't really understand these jokes.
Do you have a sense of why Korea has suddenly been able to shift this way? Because in many ways, you think of Korea as also has adopted much more of a engineering mindset on many things with LG, Samsung, others.
Yeah, I think the Koreans have been, they're an interesting case. I mean, a lot of what we see with the Koreans, with a lot of these K-pop stars, it almost feels like running them through a factory. And I have a friend who likes to watch, who likes to study a lot of the Korean dramas. They all tend to have the same plot. You have a lady who attracts the attention of someone, of a CEO or a rock star, and then later it turns out that this lady is actually of very high status herself. And so it tends to be a little bit formulaic, but they have actually, turned to almost like factory-like conditions to produce a lot of pop stars and actually produce a lot of great culture.
Well, Team Huntrix, just for the record.
Right.
No one got that? Oh, man. Get up on your K-pop, people. So maybe let's go back to technology just for this, and I want to go down this direction because we often think of Silicon Valley as this primary center of innovation, and you really, I think one of the things I thought was really helpful is your analogy of how to think about technology, particularly through the lens of cooking.
Yeah.
And so maybe take us through just to level set us on the technology components of this, of how you think about technology.
I think of technology as three distinct components. The first component of technology ought to be understood as tooling and equipment. So these are all the things that we can use and poke at. So in a kitchen analogy, it is the pots and the pans and the stove that we use to cook something. The second part of technology is written instruction. So everything that includes patents, blueprints, recipes, everything that we could write down to really try to cook something. And I think the third most important part of technology is essentially what I call process knowledge, which can also be known as tacit knowledge, industrial experience, just all of the things that exist in people's heads that aren't very easy to write down, and that also exists between people's heads in terms of a lot of conventions. I think all of us in our workplace would understand very well that it is kind of impossible to train someone up to speed by just writing a lot of instructions for them. You really need to sit them down and really try to train them. And in a kitchen analogy, imagine giving someone who has never cooked for a day in his life before the most exquisitely equipped kitchen as well as the most exquisitely detailed recipe. We can't be sure that they're capable of doing something as simple as making scrambled eggs. I think that would be challenging. You want someone who has had some experience actually cooking to actually be able to make a dish. And here's the analogy to what is happening with the US and China. Over the last 3 decades, China has become a manufacturing powerhouse, such that right now, China's manufacturing workforce is on the scale of about 70 million people. Meanwhile, the U.S. keeps losing manufacturing employment. Manufacturing employment in the U.S. has plunged, mostly due to technology changes, some because of business cycles, and in part, and small part, but in part because over the 80s, 90s, 2000s, a lot of American employers shipped their manufacturing jobs partly from the Midwest into China. So China is now the site of most manufacturing of, let's say, iPhones. Still, the majority of the world's iPhones are being built in places like Shenzhen and Henan. Shenzhen in the south, Henan in the north, which is training basically this very large workforce to assemble the most sophisticated electronics components in the world. And these people are solving, 3 new problems a day before breakfast, really to try to, figure out, how to solve their logistical problems, their supply chain issues, how to innovate. And this is partly what the U.S. has lost and partly what China has gained. And I want to, imagine a fantastic scenario in which Steve Jobs and Tim Cook decided in 2008 not to site iPhone production in Shenzhen, but rather to site it, let's say, somewhere in California or Pennsylvania or Michigan. I think it is quite possible to imagine that in this unlikely scenario, then all of the follow-on innovations of the iPhone would be produced here in the US. So I'm thinking about everything that includes consumer drones, everything that includes all sorts of electronics components, electric vehicle batteries, all of these follow-on innovations that flowed from mastering iPhone production, from very sophisticated electronics assembly. Much more of that could exist here in the US. And I think this is the core driver of China's technological advancements. It's process knowledge, not cyber theft or industrial subsidies.
Something that you mentioned in the book that really resonated with me was in that wave as Web 2.0 was taking off and big data was starting to become a thing. We actually had an email distribution list called the Data Drinking Group. And it basically became a list of all the people who were working on data, and we just get together and buy beer and pizza and just trade notes about what's working, what's not. And to your point, it really was process knowledge. It wasn't just the tech, but understanding how do we actually do things. That's actually where we came up with this term data scientist, all these things. And the line that really resonated that I think you highlighted is that the information moves at the speed of beer.
Yes.
And I really think that's a very powerful thing, and especially at the speed and the concentration of these societies. And the reason I want to bring this up is we have the beginnings of that again happening here in San Francisco, particularly with AI very concentrated. So maybe it's moving at the speed of mocha lattes or something right now. But what is that speed of transferring process knowledge looking like with new technologies like AI and other frontier tech, quantum, or other things?
Yeah. So a lot of my observations of process knowledge was, being with these entrepreneurs in Shenzhen, being among these factory workers, and just seeing how collaborative they were. If someone's fire extinguisher or something broke down, they can borrow another factory's kit, and they'll replace one later on. It turns out to be a lot of communication and collaboration. And I think that knowledge travels at the speed of beer or coffee. People chat about these sort of things. Knowledge tends to move around. People get hired into different firms. People get hired around frontier AI labs, and knowledge tends to travel quite a lot around. And so, part of my idea of, this idea that, China will catch up on a lot of technology is that, no country has monopolized any key technologies over the longer run. I think a lot about this example of Samuel Slater, who was a British industrial person who memorized a lot of mill designs in the UK, and then built a lot of textile mills in Rhode Island. And subsequently, he became known in the US as father of the second industrial revolution. In the UK, he's known as Slater the Trader. And so rather less flattering. So how will knowledge move around now? Well, maybe right now knowledge will move at the speed of pumpkin spice lattes. It's the season.
It's the season.
But I think that with AI, I think we are communicating a lot more And AI will, I think one of my hypotheses about AI is that AI will probably strengthen a lot of America's specializations as well as China's specializations. Because, what sort of data does America have a lot of, what sort of data does America have a lot of? Well, a lot of the American economy is built around, let's say, healthcare as well as services. And a lot of the Chinese economy is built around manufacturing. And I slightly worry about a situation in which China manages to automate Foxconn and the iPhone production, and they get really good at making drones as well as munitions as well, because they are able to train all of the data for the AI. And America gets even better at PowerPoints. Mm-hmm. And I think that is not going to be one of our core strategic advantages going forward, because the data is probably going to make us further down the curve of specialization of whatever we're at. And, I think this is where we really need America to rebuild its manufacturing base even more so in the age of AI.
Yeah, so maybe before we switch to some of the current actions that are taking place, electric vehicles, we saw the rapid adoption of EVs really here in California, especially in the Bay Area, around Tesla in particular. Tesla goes to China, but then China takes off in a similar way that we saw the drone markets take off. I think there's some people who would argue, hey, China dumps technologies, as you pointed out, the arguments of stealing technology, these things. You make the argument that it's really the competitive forces there that are happening. And not only that, there's nuances in that competitive forces, that some stuff actually, this goes wrong. That as a market system, this actually is going sideways. And so could you take us through a little bit of that journey with that and really take us to the point where it says, how do you think about how this is going to play out?
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the weird ways in which the U.S. and China are kind of symmetrical and having all sorts of the opposite problems. What is one problem with California? It is a lack of homes. And, I saw a statistic that after the Palisade fires in Los Angeles, one of the local authorities in one of the local neighborhoods has issued something like 3 permits out of the lot of 200 homes that were burned down. And the U.S. is persistently supply constrained in all sorts of ways. The U.S. is not building enough energy at a fast enough pace to keep up with our energy demands. Right now, there are 33 nuclear facilities, nuclear power plants under construction in China. There's 0 under construction in the U.S. This year, China will deploy about 500 gigawatts of solar alone. And this year, the U.S. will deploy about 50 gigawatts of solar.
Well, as of today, we're about to have a policy to try to invest in coal factories again.
Well, yes, we're going back to coal, and so these are sort of like just these really stark contrasts. Again, this kind of comes back to the idea that California cannot build high-speed rail, and China does. The U.S. as a writ large is not building enough energy. It's not building enough homes. I think it's especially stark here in California, and I think the Chinese are really doing a lot of that. But what are some of these nuances? What are some of the underbellies problems of China? Well, I think about something like EVs, as you point out. There's something like 10 really successful Chinese EV companies, and then there's dozens more that are mired in really difficult competition. They have a lot of debt. They need constant bailouts from the local governments because they're not making especially competitive products.
Local government, not the
local government. So, the Shenzhen government essentially only buys vehicles produced in Shenzhen. The Shanghai government essentially buys vehicles produced in Shanghai for their taxi fleets. So there's a lot of local protectionism of the local champion over there. And so, in a lot of industries, something like the solar industry, you have basically not much difference between the top 30 largest solar photovoltaic makers. They don't make a lot of money. There's kind of ruthless competition. manufacturing. It is making a lot of young Chinese upset. They come up with words like tangping, which means to lie flat, which is their means of quiet quitting. It's their way to protest against a lot of these really difficult competitive dynamics in China. A lot of companies don't make very much money. The VC market has struggled quite a lot in China over the last few years. And yet something about that system has worked. And I think on that, as I write in my book, I would really like to prefer to have a society that has some degree of physical dynamism, in which the problem is over competition rather than under competition. And I would really like for Americans to experience, better subway systems, better bridges, better highways, better rail, more choice in manufacturing, rather than to have the inverse of fewer homes, not enough rebuilding and not enough mass transit.
So not to put you on the spot, but I'm going to, is you were in China as the drone shift really took place, where DJI and other Chinese manufactured drones really outpaced everybody else. Given what you're seeing now happen with the EVs, who wins?
Yeah, well, I think my default is that in a lot of industries, when it comes to manufactured products, China is doing really well, and I'm expecting China to win in a lot of these different industries. Again, electric vehicles are incredibly competitive over there. Last I checked, by the end of this year, every 1 in 2 cars sold, half of all cars sold in China will be electric. Wow. And I don't know the comparable figures in the US, maybe someone else does, but I would be surprised if in California, 1 in every 5 vehicles is electric. So that is a much bigger market over there. It is a much more competitive market over there. They're making, much better vehicles much more cheaply than what Detroit has been capable of, in part because they iterate much faster. And we can go down the line in a lot of these different industries. We can take a look at industrial robotics. We can take a look at medical equipment. We can take a look at all sorts of boring industrial goods like hydraulic pumps. China's doing really well and catching up on all sorts of these different things. We can take a look at something like music instruments. China is making better and better guitars and pianos. If you're musical, I think in any sort of hobby or industry that we pay attention to, I think in pretty much everything that we can see, Chinese firms are getting better and better in quality and all of these sort of things. And I strongly believe that in something like 15 years, made in China will be a sign of quality in the way that made in China, in the way that made in Japan is a sign of quality now. And so, I take a look at the U.S. manufacturing base, and I continue to worry. By contrast, in America, many apex manufacturers have not done well. Take a look at companies like Boeing, companies like Intel, Detroit, even now Tesla. For the last couple of years, maybe even in the case of Detroit, last couple of decades, it's mostly been a tale of woe for a lot of these companies. And so what I really like to do is to try to reverse these sort of trajectories, because it's not great if most American manufacturers get less and less competitive, and for Chinese competitors to be competing against them in the export markets as well.
So we've got our shining star of NVIDIA right now.
Yes.
Especially in terms of market cap. What does this portend for like the NVIDIAs in with China? Is there, especially given the previous policies around Huawei and some of the recent policies of the Trump administration versus the Biden administration?
Yeah. I think that, I don't want to be a little bit too gloomy here. I think that, the US...
Because you're freaking me out.
Yeah, well, I think we should all be a little bit freaked out, man. I want to be, optimistic. I'm a Californian optimist of the future. I acknowledge that NVIDIA is doing really well. The US is building a lot of data centers, and that is actually a pretty strong sign of business and state capacity that they're actually being able to achieve that. there's a lot of frontier AI labs here, but I would not be complacent about anything. I mean, valuations is a bit of a tricky thing. These market valuations. Last I checked, Apple is valued at, let's say, $3.4 trillion. $3.5 trillion is the market value of Apple. Xiaomi is kind of a Chinese smartphone maker. They also make a whole lot of other things that include, the fans and rice cookers. Is valued at around $200 billion. But here's a crucial comparison between Xiaomi and Apple. Apple has had this kind of a semi-public plan to produce a new electric vehicle, a new car for most of, I think, the last 15 years. And it threw in the towel a couple of years ago and decided it's not going to do that. Xiaomi, by contrast, vowed in the year 2020, the CEO, Lei Jing, said, I vow that we will become a car company. This is going to be my last great entrepreneurial venture. He said he will invest about $10 billion to become a larger EV maker. What happened? Well, they didn't throw in the towel. What happened was that last year, their first major SUV rolled off the line. They submitted it for a competition at Nürburgring, which is one of these big German racing competitions, nicknamed the Green Hell because it is just really difficult and going through these mountains in Western Germany. And it turned out to be the fastest, one of the fastest SUVs in one of the categories. And right now, Xiaomi vehicles are going into the streets of China. They keep raising their production targets. And so, here we have a $200 billion valued company able to make a car, and then a $3.5 trillion valued company throwing in the towel and deciding that a car is not worth their time. And, I want to maybe it's not financially valuable to bet on the company that, is only $200 billion. Maybe it is. But, I want to have the company that is able to declare it, can make a car, and then actually follow through and actually execute.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think about the policies? You had a front row seat while writing this book to the Biden-Harris administration. Now you have a chance to, we see in the papers, you see in the conversations, with the Trump policies and a litany of policies that have been released in this last less than a year around trying to contain and try to think about China in a very different frame. And in fact, maybe whipsawing on China even. Yeah. Through your lens, how do you take us through the policy landscape, through how you see it?
Yeah. I think that, I'm not impressed with either the previous Biden administration and especially not now during the Trump administration to try to revitalize the economy. I think that the Biden administration, your former employers had, I think, a slightly better approach. I think it was the right approach of trying to, have big bills, namely 3 big bills, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, really to try to invest a lot more in the United States. And unfortunately, I think what we've seen is that the pace of actually building was pretty plodding, such that, once a bridge gets started, Donald Trump is elected, and either he will cancel your wind turbine or he will have a lot of opportunities to name big bridges after himself. And I'm much more critical of the Trump administration right now in its reindustrialization pursuit, because the numbers don't bear out that much of this is working very well. Since Liberation Day in April, we've had about 40,000 jobs lost in manufacturing. We've had about 6 months of contraction in manufacturing production. And, I think it is not the right approach to really try to reindustrialize America by cutting the funding of the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health, or scaring away a lot of researchers, or trying to deport in chains some South Korean workers that are trying to build a big new factory that will employ some Americans in Georgia. And so I feel like there is a lot of things that are going off track with policy. There are reasons to be optimistic in terms of data center build out, in terms of bright stars like NVIDIA, and even Apple is still, I have a new iPhone, and these are, there's still a lot of things that are going really well in America, but it has not demonstrated a really good capacity to build very extensively and then to really show that it can deliver a lot of the things that it needs to deliver on.
We've gotten a lot of great questions starting to come in. I want to switch gears to some of the social dynamics and the demographic changes. But maybe to put that in the lens, one of the things I thought really was powerful for me was, I think it's chapter 6 on the one-child policy. And I didn't fully appreciate what the engineering mindset, the genesis of this engineering mindset, and also what society response is to an engineering mindset approach and where it breaks down with bureaucracy. Maybe walk us through a little bit of that, and so we can start framing some of the broader changes that are taking place.
Yeah, well, I think I'm not sure if an author is allowed to have favorite chapters, but the one-child policy was my favorite chapter. So I think that the important thing about the one-child policy was that it was really one of the, researching it and thinking about it was really one of the things that helped me lock in on this idea of the engineering state. So the one-child policy was implemented in 1980 by Deng Xiaoping. China in 1980 was, basically reeling from the crisis of the Mao Zedong years. The leadership knew that China had over 1 billion people, but they could never conduct anything as organized as a census during Mao's final years. And so they thought that they had an overpopulation problem. They were reading all of these degrowth tracts coming out of mostly California from Paul Ehrlich and his wife, the population bomb, and people then were kind of freaking out. And India had a big sterilization program, and China decided to carry out the one-child policy. And crucially, the one-child policy was influenced by a very talented mathematician, this guy named Song Jian, who was one of China's most advanced cybernetics experts. He was a missile scientist, and he had access to the leadership. And he was able to convince Deng Xiaoping, the top leader, and as well as other folks, that population trajectories could be just as firmly controlled as missile trajectories. And it kind of had this elegant, simple solution, one child per couple, the very simple idea that was very, straightforward to enforce. And I think this was, just thinking about, the absurdity of having a missile scientist design population policy was, one of these things that really made me come up with this idea of the engineering state, that they treat society as yet another building material, as if people are just, building materials to be torn down and remolded as they wish. And what has been the historic record of the one-child policy? Well, I describe it mostly as a campaign of rural terror meted out against overwhelmingly female bodies in the countryside.
Do I remember right? Like there was as many abortions as the population of the United States?
According to official statistics, yes, China conducted about 321 million abortions over the 35 years of the one-child policy program, conducted about 100 million sterilizations of women. A lot of this peaked in the 1980s. And so, a lot of that has faded out from memory. But, I was reading all of these very gruesome stories of late-term forced abortions. We had a lot of these, stories of men just going up to posses of men, thugs who are going up to women and saying, "We're going to take you away," sometimes in a hog cage to have an abortion. And this produced this legacy of very severe gender imbalance in China. Many baby girls were given away for adoption. About 120,000 were given away to the United States. A lot of Americans have taken a lot of baby girls. And this this was basically, and there's something like 40 million missing girls in China due to the gender ratios imbalance throughout all of this. And obviously the irony now is that China is facing a fertility crisis. The fertility TFR, total fertility rate in China, is about 1.0. It's one of the lowest in the world, and it's far lower right now than Japan. And so this is where the engineers, treat society as an engineering exercise, create a lot of problems, and are trying to use engineering tactics to induce women to have childbirths again. Right now we have news reports of these party committees formed in neighborhoods going up to women in cities like Shanghai to ask, hey, when was your last menstrual cycle? Don't you want to have a child right now? And won't you consider that cats and dogs are no replacement for babies? And the most striking detail that I saw was a woman complaining that her parents have only asked her after marriage once whether she wants to have a child, whereas the party committees have already asked her 6 times. And so, these are the sort of things that are just very strange when you have rule by engineers.
Huh. What does that say or tell you about China's ability to make forward progress?
I think that China is able to lurch forward in these strange, unpredictable ways and peculiarly jerky rhythms. So China is basically, sometimes goes forward, often gets, 1% better and then 10% worse. And so they lurch forward in kind of unpredictable ways. Sometimes in the case of zero COVID, it seemed like they were controlling zero COVID really, really well. They were following all of the WHO guidelines in 2020, imposing all of these centralized quarantines. Frankly, they were probably doing far more than what the WHO actually demanded, but they held on to this much too long, and holding on to this in the teeth of the Omicron variant was definitely the wrong move. And so when China gets its mind to it, it can really move really fast. The problem is that they can very easily move in a completely absurd direction, and they move society in a big way in totally the wrong direction. And, I want to defend the lawyers somewhat here a little bit, which is to say that, I think lawyers are guarantors of debate. They're guarantors of pluralism. And they are able to, restrain stupid ideas like the one-child policy. The U.S. never considered something like as stupid as the one-child policy over here. And so, I think what lawyers do have really important roles to play. And, what I want is not rule by engineers alone. What I want is not rule by lawyers alone. Let's have a little bit of pluralism in our elites.
I think that's well said, because the lawyers are kind of brakes for bad ideas many times. I want to take that a little bit further, because we're seeing this time right now where you're seeing both countries saying, hey, we want to institute policies of more children. It doesn't feel always well thought out of what does that mean with childcare and other support systems. And then we also have this side where here we just saw in the last few weeks of policies that are anti-science in many ways, of getting rid of vaccines here in the United States. You highlight in the book also one of your personal pet peeves of the statement "follow the science." Blindly following the science, follow the science, I should say. And so I would love to get your nuance from what you've written to what's happened now through the lens of the policies that we're seeing around try to have more children, vaccines. I know it's a bunch of different things that are a jumble, but sometimes, honestly, the policies feel like a jumble.
Yeah, the policies, they are a jumble now. I definitely agree with that. I think that, maybe it is good to have a, national conversation about, whether women should have more kids. And I think it is fine to discuss something like that. And then it is to, create some better support systems for women to feel comfortable having children. And I think it would be totally the wrong approach to, have, a kind of a semi-coercive, government. We're from the government and we're here to help you have children is kind of maybe the second most frightening.
And neither of the societies, ours nor China's, are talking about what's the role of the man.
Yeah. That's right. Well, an interesting thing is that with the one-child policy, most of the punishment was dealt to the women's bodies. The women were overwhelmingly the ones having tubal ligations and having all sorts of very traumatic sterilizations. But now, actually, according to China's official health tables, it is now almost impossible for men in China to get vasectomies. A few years ago, there would be like 100,000 vasectomies in China. According to the last year of data, there were 9,000. And so it's completely collapsed. And men are complaining they can't get vasectomies anymore. And so this is once more the engineering approach until, now more on that are dealing with men. I would like to see, a country that is, has a better vaccine policy, because it seems like mRNAs are an extremely promising technology. I would like to see, a little bit less breathlessness on Tylenol. I think that would also be good. But it is not what we're getting now. And what we are getting now seems to be more faith-driven over here, more ideological driven over in China. Let's get a happier medium than what these two countries are able to offer.
What are your friends in China saying to you in response to what is happening from out of the White House, out of the policy layers?
Yeah, I think the Chinese writ large are very reactive to what U.S. presidents say in a way that I think few Americans ever look at what Xi Jinping says. But plenty of Chinese think about what the American president says. And so when, generally, I think, I'm reliving a little bit of history now, but in my first few years of living in China, the first Trump administration, Chinese didn't feel all that upset, because Trump was always saying how he admired Xi Jinping, had this great head of hair, a wonderful coif that's very well pomaded. And he always talked nicely about Chinese. It was like Germans and Japanese that he wasn't very nice to. But then the COVID pandemic happened, and Trump had all of these very inflammatory things to say, calling it Kung flu. And so a lot of Chinese got quite upset by that rhetoric in particular. And I feel like, the Chinese are very sensitive to the headlines around the US, in the way that a lot of Europeans are also very sensitive to the headlines about the US. Europeans read a lot of news about how the US is, turning people back at the border, ICE raids, whatever. And in China, it's worse, because the state media has total control over what people see, and they are much more inflammatory, and they portray this much worse. And so, I think one of the things that I'm struck by is just how nervous the rest of the world is about traveling to the U.S. I'm a Canadian citizen, and I'm always worried about every time I cross into the U.S. border, because the CBP officer could always turn you away or detain you. And I've been saying that actually America's answer to the CCP might be the CBP, the Customs and Border Patrol, because they just have so much power, and it can feel pretty arbitrary. And I think there is also another group that I look at, which are, a lot of AI researchers. A lot of the top AI researchers in Silicon Valley are of Chinese heritage, often of Chinese nationality. Many of them did their undergrad or graduate degrees in China. And this is a group that is wavering about whether or not to stay in the US, whether or not they want to stay in these frontier labs. On the one hand, the pay from Meta is really good. On the other hand, what they have to deal with is just all of these infrastructural logistical failures over here that they SFO is a great airport, but there's all of these issues with Caltrain integration and BART, and when they land in San Francisco or they land in Shenzhen, it's a much smoother experience, and they like that. They are attracted to that. They are sometimes afraid of this rhetoric. Some of them are on H-1Bs, and now all H-1Bs are frozen, and for a lot of employers, and sometimes they just they just really miss the noodles from back home. And so it's a mix of politics, personal, employer, social issues. But for this group, of pretty fluid people who go back and forth, it's not crazy to me that some more of these very elite AI researchers will decide to move to China over the next few years.
Well, will they move to China? Because you actually presented this very powerful argument about how many Chinese, the youth of China maybe is the best way to describe it, or a large demographic who want to leave China. They feel oppressed, especially in the wake of the COVID policies that happened there. And how many people have actually tried to immigrate to the United States through the Darien Gap and other methods. And so with even this, will they go somewhere else? Will they go to China or stay in China?
Yeah, these are fluid groups. I think a lot about three particular groups of people who have become very alienated by the policies from Beijing over the last couple of years. First group are just rich people, people who have options and who have the money to leave. And according to some of these statistics, these are really difficult to compile, but something like 13,000 millionaires departed from China in 2024. They moved to places like Japan, Singapore, the UK, the US, where they buy a home and live very comfortably. Another group that I spend a lot of time actually with are creative types, former journalists, former artists who have felt increasingly strangled by the censorship apparatus in China, and who decide that they would rather live away. I've spent a month with some of these people in northern Thailand in the end of 2023, where these people are just like American kids. They're making memes, they're getting into cryptocurrencies, they're smoking drugs that are legal in the state of California, and they are just really excited to have creative pursuits. And they're also present in New York. They're also present in Amsterdam. There's many of these hubs out there. And then the third group of people are, some of these people who are not necessarily very rich, not necessarily very educated, who fly to Ecuador from China, where Ecuador doesn't demand a visa from them up until the recent past, and then they walk across the southwestern border. And so according to U.S. government statistics, in 2024, the U.S. was apprehending something like 30,000 to 40,000 Chinese nationals every month who were able to brave this journey. And I think it's just really incredible that so many Chinese want to take leave of the great rejuvenation that's undertaken in their name by Xi Jinping. But it is a real and striking thing that many of them do leave. But I think the situation is fluid. Many of these Chinese do go back and forth. I think that many of these top AI researchers are not, they're not going to get comparable salaries in the UK. The UK has arguably even worse infrastructure issues than the US. And so, when ByteDance comes knocking to say, here's a pretty good pay package, we'll give you a prime position, you can be politically safe here. Oh, and by the way, check out our noodles. Some of them are actually kind of compelled by this sort of offer.
Okay. Interesting day today, especially given what's going on upstairs. And we have a lot of the tech leaders who now, they look at books like The Three-Body Problem, as you highlighted, and those tech leaders are looking at now empowered with policy, particularly in this administration. And look like sometimes they feel like they're approaching it from an engineering mindset as well. And so are we at risk of overcorrecting here in the U.S.?
Yeah. I think the first thing to do is to say that I want to defend the lawyers again, and I want to defend, in particular, the federal judiciary. When Trump does something illegal, it is right for the judiciary to block all of these actions, and so we don't want to have something of we don't want lawlessness. Absolutely not. But I wonder the extent to which some of these tech leaders are actually building a lot of projects inside the U.S. government. I think a lot about, the figure of Elon Musk. In the early days of Doge, maybe that could have represented America's venture back into an engineering state. America used to be an engineering state. It used to build a lot, and the lawyers took over, as I argue in my book, throughout the 1960s. And maybe we could have imagined that Mr. Musk could have brought America back. But rather than build great projects inside the government, Musk was much more about trimming the workforce, as if that were the big cause of government deficits, which is mostly driven by entitlements as well as the Defense Department. So I think that what we had was kind of a shearing off of state capacity, a shearing off of essential government functions, rather than trying to build it up. If we're firing half the team that assesses new drugs at the FDA, that doesn't really seem like that is a pro biotech program to me. And so I think in all sorts of ways, what we're getting is a strange system in the U.S. which it's very personalist. It doesn't. It's not very about government efficiency. It is not, doing a lot of important things. And I'm thinking here is that what America has now is authoritarianism without the good stuff, without the good stuff of functioning logistics, smoothly ordered cities, a good infrastructure. Rather, it seems to be this, sort of these very random actions that are not very well coordinated and mostly set America back on technology.
Mm-hmm. That was going to be one of the questions that came up in here was dictatorships, autocracy, and how to think it through for the trade-offs, but as things evolve.
Yeah, I think again, going back to this point of authoritarianism without the good stuff, on April 2nd, when Trump announced Liberation Day, I was thinking that liberation is not a very American word. It's much more of a Chinese word, and so it didn't sound very American to my ears. And so what we have is kind of the autocracy, again, without the good stuff, where Trump is, I think, learning the worst things from Xi Jinping. Both Trump and Xi are visiting misfortune among some of the least fortunate. They're, saying goodbye to data probity. They expect adulation at every turn, where, you just have to praise them in every policy, no matter how boneheaded. And so, I think that what we never want is autocracy. I think what we want is some degree of an effective government that does the things that it says it wants to do, that does the things it wants to do at reasonable cost. So, thinking about San Francisco, there is these infamous stories of the $1.4 million public toilet, right? That cost way too much. When I used to live here in San Francisco, Van Ness was under construction, Van Ness Avenue. They needed to have a new bus lane. Essentially, that took about 20 years to do the bus lanes. When I was there, when I was last living here, they announced that they messed up on the maps and they had the piping all wrong, and so they had to redo all of that again. And so this is where it seems like it is much more difficult to add netting around the Golden Gate Bridge than it is to actually build the bridge. And after by now, this is 17 years after the referendum, and we don't have high-speed rail. It's not clear that many heads have rolled over this failure. When we want high-speed rail, we should actually get high-speed rail, and it should actually gleam. And this is the sort of thing that we should want it to do. And I don't think that this is a framing of autocracy versus democracy. I think that there should be no intrinsic way that democracies cannot build rail. Plenty of democracies in the rail world, Japan, Spain, France have built excellent high-speed rail lines. And so I don't want I don't want the US to get to China levels of construction. Let's just get to Spain, Japan, and France, where they have very effective infrastructure and have not trampled over everyone's rights.
People are asking about your commentary on abundance.
Yeah. Well, I spoke at the Abundance conference. I'm a card-carrying member of Abundance. Ken was there. He listened to me on a panel with a UMichigan law professor. And I think that abundance is mostly the right solution. I think that what we should have is basically the ability to do the stuff that we say that we want to do. We should deliver homes to people who need the homes and to people who want the homes. And we should be able to, answer a lot of problems through improving state capacity as well as expanding the supply side and not just subsidizing our way out of every problem. And so I think, there's plenty of critiques of abundance. It is elitist, it is coastal, the podcast host voices are kind of annoying, perhaps, but I think that abundance.
Surely not mine.
Not yours. Not your DJ. Your voice is soothing, and it is and an excellent voice here. But I think that abundance is the answer for a lot of difficult problems. I think.
What's the thing that when you think about the reaction to your book? What's been the surprising reaction here in the U.S. to the book? And then what's been the general reaction out of China?
Yeah. I think I have been somewhat surprised that there have been both the parts of the American left and parts of the American right have been pretty enthusiastic about the book. I've had very good reviews in Jacobin magazine, which is a lefty publication. And I've been well reviewed in Wall Street Journal and Compact and whatever else. And so I think that has been positive. I think I've expected a normal amount of distress from one of the perils of being a China author is that if you say that China does anything good, there will be a lot of people jumping down your throat. If you say that China does anything bad, there will be also a lot of people jumping down your throat. And I'm saying that China has done a lot of amazing things economically, that for the most part, building a lot is good. But it has been more repressive in a lot of different ways. And so I think I've upset all the China folks, and that is quite normal and expected.
Would you call those the China hawks, or would you call them something different?
I think the China hawks, some China hawks have been upset, and some tankies. This is a left-on-left slur of people who think that China is a wonderful socialist utopia. They have been upset that I criticize China pretty extensively in my book. And so, a lot of tanky hatred for me, and that's okay. But the reaction out of China right now is still fairly muted. There's been some discussion in state media of my book, and I'm kind of curious where they end up with. I feel like they are a little bit patient. They're going to figure out what their response is going to be.
In just a short little 20 seconds we have left, what is your optimistic sentiment for both countries?
I want the U.S. to be 20% more engineering, fix our deficiencies in building homes and mass transit and solar and wind. I want China to be 50% more lawyerly. I want the government to learn to leave people alone, to respect creative impulses, to be able to recognize that Chinese youths are, just as talented and creative as a lot of American youths. And I hope one day that the Chinese people can actually be left alone by the engineers.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a perfect note to end on. Our thanks to Dan Wang, author of Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future, and Ken and his family fund. If you'd like to support the Commonwealth Club's effort in making virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit www.commonwealthclub.org. And if you are not a member, please consider becoming a member. I'm DJ Patil, and thank you and take care.